Hamantak This is Nick Estes, co-host of the Red Nation Podcast. Welcome to today's live stream. Before we get started, really excited for our guest, Christine McCleave. Before we get started, before I do introductions, I just want to remind you that we're also cross-streaming on the East is a Podcast YouTube channel. So hello to all of East is the Podcast. This is a really exciting week in our sort of lineup. So tomorrow we're actually doing a live stream for the Nation Podcast. All of the hosts will be on. There should be at least like 4 or 5 of us. So tune in tomorrow, but on the same time. And then also on Thursday, I'm doing a live stream podcast on Red Scare. It's the Substack with special guests, Gabriel Rockhill on his new book, Who Paid the Pipers. So we will be subscribed to my podcast. You just go to like substack.com/Nick Estes. It's an offshoot of this podcast. It'll be free. There won't be any paywall or anything like that for the live stream. So please subscribe there, but also check out our live stream tomorrow, end of the year sort of recap with the Red Nation Podcast crew. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our special guest today, Christine McCleave. But before I do that, I'll give some background story, some backstory about how we actually met, because I'd actually like to hear some of your sort of personal history and your biography. So we actually met at Carlisle Industrial Indian School, of all places, the infamous boarding school, off-reservation boarding school, which was founded in the latter half of the 19th century by Richard Henry Pratt. But we were there on the 100th anniversary of its closing. I was writing a story for High Country News at the time, and Christine was one of the people that I had interviewed the time she was with Native American boarding school Healing Coalition.
Yeah.
Apologies. I just know it as NABS. They've done some of the, Christine as well as others have done some amazing work. We've actually done podcasts on boarding schools, many podcasts actually on boarding schools. And so coming full circle on that, we were at Leanne Simpson talk and here at the University of Minnesota. And you just finished your PhD at the University of Alaska. And it was just serendipitous because I was like, well, what was your dissertation on? And you were like Indigenous medicines. And so that's how this topic came about, because she and I had been talking about having somebody on. You know, we've had Vivi Camacho on from Bolivia. She is a vice minister of ancestral medicines for the plurinational state of Bolivia. We were hoping to have her on. She talked a little bit about it in our last podcast episode that she did. But this is a topic that I've been interested in. My research isn't in this area, so it's a little bit new to me, but it's something that I see coming up in other sort of podcast realms, especially like in the manosphere. There's all this stuff around doing psychedelics and always decontextualize of the sort of indigenous and colonial context for which they're used. So without further ado, with that big introduction, maybe you can start by introducing yourself, give a little bit of background of how you got to this point, and maybe talk a little bit about what got you into this kind of research.
Yeah, sure. Chimigwich, thank you for having me here today, Nick. Buju and Dinaway Magani Duke, Dindizi and Dijinikas, Makinak Waju and Dunjaba, Magizi and Dudame. Greetings, my relatives. Thanks for tuning in and listening or watching after the live broadcast. My name is Christine Dindisi McCleave. Dindisi means blue jay. I'm Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, and I'm Eagle Clan. And I used to be the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. How I got there was my grandfather and my great-grandfather went to Indian boarding school, and I did my master's in leadership research on Native American spirituality and Christianity, really exploring that history within my family, covering some of the boarding school era. And at that time, when I was doing that research, the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission had just gotten started. So I had started reading some of the testimony coming out, and it just really broke my heart. And I started thinking about my grandfather experiencing some of those horrible abuses that we know happened. And so that's how I ended up doing that boarding school healing work. And I actually didn't learn that my great-grandfather went to Carlisle Indian boarding school until I was already working at NABS. So I always encourage people to ask their relatives about it, because, you know, boarding school stuff, sometimes in our families, our relatives don't talk about it, or they don't think about it as, you know, something that was maybe significant or impactful until you start asking them questions and they start telling stories. But in that master's research, you know, speaking of serendipity, you know, things, there's threads throughout your life, right? So part of the Native American Spirituality and Christianity Lit Review talked about peyote religion, the Native American church. And I was just, you know, including it as an example of syncretic religion, merging the earth-based Native American spiritual traditions with Christianity. And so in my head, the Native American church was syncretic. It was a blend of the two. And then at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, I started doing some research about different healing modalities. And with all the, you know, information we had about historical trauma and how childhood trauma and intergenerational trauma affect our mental health and our spiritual health, our emotions and behaviors. I came across this interesting conference by the Multidisciplinary Association on Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. And it said something about some cultural perspectives on these psychedelic medicines. And so I went to that conference, and there was only one other Native person. It's a miracle there was a Native person there besides me, because there was only a couple hundred people. But yeah, I talked, and she started introducing me to some more people in that psychedelic movement. And we talked a lot about, her name was Dawn Davis. Hey, Dawn. We talked a lot about how triggering it was to be there as Native people, you know, looking at these medicines from different indigenous traditions. So like peyote, ayahuasca, iboga from Africa, mushrooms from the Mazatec region in Mexico. And, you know, having to hear it through this white filter and this psychedelic lens. And really the crux of it is that this psychedelic movement is the mainstream Western, you know, colonial culture seeking healing, seeking healing for all the things that we are dealing with in this modern world, and using indigenous medicines to do so. And so there's different points of access. I'll get into that later. And, you know, people are coming at it from different entry points. But this whole, like, this is triggering, we're looking for our healing, and y'all want to heal without acknowledging that, that A, we had these traditions, and then B, you came along as, you know, Christianity, and demonized them and put us in boarding schools and prohibited them and abused us for practicing them. And now you're romanticizing indigenous peoples and wanting this wisdom that had to go underground to survive. And the whole thing was just, you know, like spiritual hypocrisy, historical amnesia. And I was like, I must do something. I am compelled to write about this and tell people what I see. So I went to go do my PhD at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and my focus was on peyote, because being a tribal member here in the US, that's the one that I have legal access to under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And so I asked a bunch of questions in my research about what Native people were doing for their healing, how they were interacting with peyote in the Native American church, and if they had any concerns about the religious freedom rights that we have, and how they were feeling about the psychedelic movement. So we can talk about some of those results, but I literally just hit submit yesterday on the final edits to publish. So it will be published on ProQuest any day now. I paid for open access so everybody can read it. I hope you all read it.
So when this goes up, we'll put the link in the show notes so people can check it out.
Great.
Yeah. So you brought up several things. So first of all, like when we were in, like, this is kind of how a lot of this stuff works. And, you know, when we were in Carlisle, I actually didn't know that my great grandmother had gone to Carlisle either. Like I actually found her in the records, and is something that I don't I don't even know if my family understood this at all, but it made me think, and this is related to what you just talked about, but it made me think that there's like no generation of Native people that's unaffected by boarding schools and the history of that. The second part that you talked about, the second topic you brought up, is this notion of syncretism, especially when it comes to the Native American Church. And maybe you can give us a little bit of background on what the Native American Church is and how it was founded, but also how something like peyote is sort of central to its practice, and how that often it was criminalized at one point in time. I mean, you're wearing a shirt that is. I think this is the one that we talked about that is in Texas, right?
Yeah.
The conservation, the peyote gardens down there. But yeah, maybe give us a little bit of background on NAC, because I think that's where most people might encounter this topic, is looking at how there's this federal law that protects the consumption and the use of this particular medicine.
Yeah. Well, there's so many stories, oral traditions. What I found, because I didn't grow up in the Native American Church, what I found was that each person who grew up with this in their family knows their story. They know exactly how peyote came to their family, their tribe. There are some common shared stories about Peyote woman, who was on one of the trails of tears doing a long walk, and she had fallen ill and fell behind, and she was about to die when Creator told her to eat this cactus, that this would be medicine for her, and she was able to stay alive and make it to be with her people. So I wouldn't want to, and this wasn't the focus of my research, was to the origin story of the NAC. So I wouldn't want to share a story and like leave somebody out of it. But really, the NAC has been what I would call kind of like a growing religious movement. Some scholars say that it was formed as a church using that language because of the previous religious persecution on traditional spiritual ways, with the boarding school era, the prohibition there, and the forced conversion to Christianity, but also like the ghost dance movement being the impetus for the Wounded Knee Massacre. I mean, Native people were literally killed for praying, singing, and dancing in our traditional ways. So some people some participants in the research study talked about how this umbrella of it being a church and being related to Christianity was a survival mechanism, that they blended that way out of necessity. And I found a very interesting continuation from my master's research to the doctoral dissertation, which was that there are some Native people who are practicing wholeheartedly Christianity and embrace that ideology, that worldview, those teachings. And there are some Native people who have rejected all things Christian and say that the only way to really heal is to go back to our original spiritual teachings and ways. And then there's a lot of people in the middle. There's a lot of people who kind of, land at different points in the spectrum, who blend practices and beliefs to different extents. So there's no way I can just kind of give a pat answer and say like, this is how it started and this is where it's at, because it's really been something that's constantly evolving and is unique to each kind of region and tribe, or even down to families, that it's been passed on through generations.
Yeah, I think that's an important point of like heterogeneity and diversity. I think even looking like, I don't know, I know for Lakota people, at least to my knowledge, and I could, I'm not saying that I'm an expert on this at all, but at least to my personal knowledge, we never had psychedelics or like medicines that, that would do these kinds of things like peyote. It was actually introduced later, often through the Native American Church, and was later, some people have adopted it. But just like, as you're saying, there are some folks who lean more to the Christian side, some are in the middle, and some reject it. That's also with people who don't even practice,
exactly.
NAC, like who are maybe consider themselves like traditionalists, they are also very Christian. They go to church. Some of them reject Christianity entirely, and some of them are just
Yes.
like in the middle. Some just don't care, you know?
Exactly. And that's what I wrote about in my thesis, my master's thesis, was just, native spirituality and Christianity. What are people doing? What are they believing? And that, yeah, like you said, it has nothing to do with peyote, but I found that it also applied within the Native American church. And I'm seeing just like a few comments, some people talking about MAPS and MDMA. And so why don't I take this quick opportunity to just give a tiny overview for folks. The term psychedelics is, a more modern term, and it means mind manifesting. Another term that is used to refer to these medicines is entheogenic, which means like God within, and also kind of God entheo, and then genic is like it's hallucinogenic. So they kind of mash those words up. I can't remember the guy that coined that term, but from Indigenous perspective, and these medicines I mentioned are global. They're all over the world in various Indigenous traditions and many tribes that engage with them. Like, for example, ayahuasca in Amazonian region is huge, and it's like over a few different countries, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil. Like the Amazon is huge, and there's so many tribes, and they're not all going to be like a monolith, culturally. So we're talking about medicines that come from various Indigenous traditions, and from the various Indigenous traditions, to make a simple generalization, they are referred to as spiritual medicines, and they're referred to as medicine, which is a thing that the psychedelic movement has adopted to now call them medicines. But I wish I could quote myself more accurately, but I'll paraphrase. There was a line in my dissertation where I was like, they really don't understand when they say medicine. They've adopted our term, but they don't really understand, because in the Indigenous cosmology, these are living beings. These are autonomous spirits. They are powerful spirits, and you have to have a relationship with them. You have to approach them with respect, and there are spiritual protocols. And so what's happening a little bit with the psychedelic movement is, if people are entering into psychedelic access wanting a spiritual religious experience, they are either going to retreats down in the Amazon or in Mexico or even other places in the world. And sometimes these retreats are run by Indigenous people. And sometimes these retreat centers are run by non-Indigenous people, mainly white people who've learned from Indigenous people. And so do they truly have permission? Is it cultural appropriation? There's no easy answer, and it's probably a case-by-case basis. But there is a growing movement here in the US to access these medicines under RFRA, which is not the same as ERFA. ERFA is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and RFRA is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was only made possible by ERFA and American Indian Advocacy. So now white people are using RFRA to access Indigenous medicines. Yeah, you're welcome.
Can you talk a little bit more about RFRA and like what it actually, like what is it in like sort of enshrine in terms of like, if it's building off of the American Indian religious freedom, like what is it, like what more is it adding? Is that specifically I guess I just don't know.
Yeah. And, you're kind of catching me on the spot here, because I'm having a hard time remembering, that gets into, I did some legal analysis, but my dissertation is interdisciplinary. So a little bit of a jack of all trades, trying to be a master of some. But so there were several lawsuits that went forward, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, so please don't judge me. But essentially, we have religious freedom under the Second Amendment in the Constitution, but Native people didn't actually have that religious freedom, because there were all these other policies that were made to say that we couldn't be praying, that Indian agents of the federal government could withhold rations if we were praying in our sacred ways, if we weren't sending our children to boarding school, if we weren't converting to Christianity. So we did not actually have freedom of religion, although it was supposed to be for everyone in the United States. And so the 1978 ERFA went into effect. But then there was a later case in 1994 with Reuben Snake, and it was, states' right versus federal rights. And so it went up to the Supreme Court. And then there was an amendment to AIRFA, which said specifically beyond religious freedom for American Indians that we could use peyote as a sacrament through bona fide American Indian religious practices. And that's what it says, kind of, like verbatim. Those are the key words. And then I can't remember exactly how RFRA came about, but it was, I think, the same year, in some connection there. I can't remember exactly how that happened, but there have been some recent lawsuits. People have been suing the DEA because their psychedelic medicines, their sacraments, like ayahuasca, have been confiscated, and they're claiming that these are like under the peyote protections for American Indians. They're saying under RFRA, we're claiming RFRA, our religious freedom restoration, because I guess apparently the Second Amendment just wasn't enough for anyone. So they're saying, we needed this extra law too, and so they were like, we're using these as a sacrament with a bona fide religion. And there was a famous case with a church down in Phoenix called the Eagle and the Condor, the Church of the Eagle and the Condor. And they won they got settled. The DEA actually settled and said, we're sorry we took your ayahuasca, which was kind of a precedent there. So we're probably going to see more of that coming. And then some people are also accessing these medicines through the psychedelic movement in a more clinical, medical Western model. So around therapy, there's plenty of psychedelic studies. Like if you can go down a rabbit hole, people have taken what were whole plant medicines with a spirit and a history and a relationship to indigenous peoples, and dissected them into molecules, synthesized them, modified them, and done all kinds of things to them that maybe is spiritually unethical depending on your worldview. And there's all kinds of pharmaceuticals being developed right now. So MDMA is not a traditional plant medicine. It's a synthetic that was created. So there's all kinds of, the psychedelic ecosystem is very large, and there's plenty of perspectives to pursue if you really want to look into it.
Yeah, you're bringing up, there's so many like minefields here, like that you're raising. Like, I think even using the language of the sacred, like that actually the word sacred comes from Christian traditions. It means something that is non-defiled, it has a special status, and it's often related to the notion of purity. And so even translating that into the context of indigenous cosmologies it can be fraught, because like even for our term, like we would say wakan, it's like translated into sacred, but it doesn't actually mean that, right? And so I think what you're getting at is like even the translation of these medicines into different contexts presents different problems. Like even it's if you think of it in the terms of like a technology, like we think of technology as something that's like artificial and separate from society, but actually it's something that cultures create all the time, and they cultivate plants, animals, and things like that. They have relationships with them. The perfect example is corn. Corn has been so integrated into the modern world that it's just taken for granted. But it was a plant that was built, through millennia, since time immemorial, of relationships of indigenous people cultivating it, that only grew in this particular region. And now it's turned into, a monocrop, all these different things. And some would say that it's sort of violating that relationship, that reciprocal and sort of accountable relationship to this species. And so when you're talking about these issues, it might be hard for some people to sort of wrap their heads around it, that like not everything should be up for grabs.
Yeah.
And if things are going to be used in a way, there needs to be like ethical conversations around it. And what you're sort of pointing at though is that these, we haven't really talked about, there's several aspects of this. I think one, we can look at the sort of hippie culture that have developed around it, like as a form of amusement or entertainment, right? Doing drugs for recreation.
Mhm.
Then there's the sort of clinical aspect that you're talking about. I actually think the first actually opens up to the second, because it's through this kind of experimentation that people do realize that, wow, there might be some kind of medical, use or some sort of therapeutical use for these things. But along the way, you're also saying that these, no matter if it's for recreation, as you're talking about in the context of like ayahuasca and these camps and these workshops and retreats that people are creating in the Amazon, or if you go back to like even the 1960s and the drug culture, like the opening up of psilocybin mushrooms, they went, I can't remember the exact location that you said in Mexico, but they went to an indigenous community and began to sort of extract those psilocybin mushrooms. And then it became sort of a recreational use. And now like in, the Northwest, there's states that have decriminalized this, and they're now using psilocybin as a form of therapy. But it's completely like detached and decontextualized from its origins, which is follows just about every sort of colonial story of plunder and resource extraction.
Ding, 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 ding.
So let's maybe get into like those first two aspects, because I do want to talk about your study and your interviews, and if you can share some of your results. But maybe we can talk about that first aspect, the recreational aspect. Like, what are the ethical concerns of this, and how has it impacted indigenous communities and their relationships to these medicines?
Absolutely. So I like what you said, and I do call these medicines indigenous biotechnology, and put that in my terms and definitions. I also included biopiracy, because if this is indigenous biotechnology, if you don't have free prior informed consent to access them, and you just take it and commodify it and commercialize it, for your own profit and benefit, then that's biopiracy. You've stolen it, this biotechnology. So I talked about the Nagoya Protocol too, where there's a protocol to create an agreement, basically, a contract that says the indigenous people will give the consent and give you access, like agree that, yes, you can use our medicine. Like, what a novel concept. Access and benefit sharing. You can use our medicine as long as you, go through us as the cultivator, because we are the stewards. We're going to make sure that we're paying attention to conservation of this medicine, which have to limit the supply, because our people are going to get supply first before your people get supply. The benefit sharing could take the form of just, if you're going to create a product, if you're going to do research and development, you give us a portion of your profits, right? The Nagoya Protocol can take all of these forms. And so I'll get to your question here in a second, but so far, of all these medicine traditions, if you place them as groups, the Bwiti tribes of Gabon, Africa, are the only ones who have given free prior informed consent to access and benefit sharing of their natural medicine, Iboga. And none of the other groups have. And, if you think about trying to unite all the various tribes of the Amazon to come to an agreement, like, I don't know if that's ever going to happen. And then if anybody who knows here in the United States, you're probably not going to get them peyote tribes to agree either. So good luck with all of that. And then the mushrooms. Yeah, it was Maria Sabina was the curandera who shared mushrooms under the strict agreement of secrecy with Gordon Wasson in the 1960s. And he had a mushroom ceremony with her. And then he went back to the United States and wrote an article for Life magazine. And I don't know, within a couple of years, I'm not the historical expert on this, but there are people who are within a short amount of time, like John Lennon was in her village, so she died in exile.
Yeah.
She was exiled by her people for bringing the world to their doorstep. And I see a lot of art that really depicts her as like a saint, because it's did she play her her fated role in introducing mushrooms to the world? Because a lot of people have had healing with mushroom medicine, and so it's just the effects on indigenous people is wide and varied. And again, you have to take it, case by case basis, tribes, villages, communities, individuals. So it's hard to make big generalizations, but overall, my research shows that the psychedelic movement is causing harm to Native American people. That was my population study, tribal members here in the United States. And I was part of the Colorado working group under their Natural Medicine Health Act. So Oregon was the first to legalize, and they did mushrooms. They did a mushroom program. And then Colorado did a voter initiative, and Colorado did mushrooms, DMT. Now, say they called it natural medicine, but then they named the molecules instead of the actual plants. But DMT would be either from ayahuasca or the bufo frog, which is actually 5-MeO DMT. And then iboga, or ibogaine as they named it, and ibogaine's the synthetic, iboga's the plant, and mescaline containing cacti, parentheses, excluding peyote, end parentheses. So that one's weird too, because it's like mescaline containing cacti would be San Pedro, which is called Huachuma in Peru, or I've heard it called Bolivian torch, but I've also heard it called Peruvian torch. So there's only 2 other cacti besides peyote that have mescaline. And they did exclude mescaline because of some Native American advocacy over the last few years. The decriminalized nature movement was including peyote for a while, and Native American church members stood up and said, hey, no, that you can't do that. That's our medicine. It's protected. Hands off. And so they actually listened. That took a few years. But yeah, so, we got legal access, various medicines. New Mexico just came online with psilocybin. So now there's 3 states, and Colorado's, has all these other medicines which haven't all been implemented yet, but they decided, yes, this is impacting Indigenous people. So we're going to form a working group to inform us of, how to mitigate these harms. And the proper name is really long. It was written in the law as the Federally Recognized American Tribes and Indigenous Communities Working Group, but I just call it the Tribal or Indigenous Working Group for short. We wrote a report. We met for almost a year. We answered 4 questions that were written into the mandate that we would address these issues. How does this act, this law in Colorado affect the practice of these traditional religious medicine ways? How to avoid over commercialization, which, I mean, if you're legalizing, you're commercializing it. So just don't. How about that? There's a very simple answer for that, right? How does it affect conservation? And then what are some best practices? And you can read that report on the Colorado Medicine website, and you'll see that it was a very painful process for the working group to go through. The Native and Indigenous peoples in that working group, and myself included as their moderator facilitator, had to work through some very hard things. The extractive nature of colonial government saying, oh, we made a law that has negatively impacted you, and now we want you to work for free to tell us how it impacted you. It was really difficult.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack there. I think, I was just sitting there thinking, like, these laws that are meant to sort of clarify, like, what can and cannot be used is also like, but I was also thinking of, like, Colorado is, like, I think being one of the first states to also legalize marijuana. I mean, just to take like a drug, like a substance like marijuana, a plant like marijuana, and like it's advertised as like, this. I grew up with brothers and relatives and friends who would always say this. It's like, how can you criminalize a plant that comes from the earth? And I was like, well, try smoking the weed today, because it's really different than the weed that you may have been like trying to get legalized or defending, because it's like because of capitalism and because of the profit motive, the THC content, it's gone way up. And also you have this, they have things called dabs, which I've just learned about. I'm sorry,
like pure concentrate.
So it's like
99% THC.
And so so then we have, we also, this happens in the the psychedelic realm as well, is that it's something like you get these synthetic drugs that are like extreme kind of versions of the plant, or I hesitate to use the term natural, but I would say maybe the historic or traditional kind of forms of them.
Yeah.
So it also shows how like the market and the profit motive also alter these substances, because they're catering. I would argue that they're in this realm, they're catering to a recreational use to try to get this kind of experience, right? And it follows like all the sort of like everything that you're talking about. I was just thinking about like how all these kind of boom and bust cycles of colonial extraction, right? You have something like tar sands. Oh, this has always been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, and but we don't want to refine it because it's not really good oil. But then when they get the technology to do it, oh, we're going to do this now, we're going to start refining this oil, or like doing fracking, right? They're going to find a way to do it at some point. There's going to be a bust or a boom cycle, and it's going to they're going to go into all these communities, these indigenous communities. There's going to be all kinds of social problems that are introduced, and then they're just going to leave once they've gotten what they've wanted. And then it's left for these communities, like this individual you're talking about getting exiled from her own community. It's left for them to clean up the mess, right? Or we're going to make laws because we have this social problem. It's not really drugs, it's this system of alienation and profit that has created drug abuse and drug addiction. And we have to create a set of laws to kind of regulate that, but we kind of messed up on this. So indigenous people come in and advise us and help us work through this.
Indigenous people have so many examples of the way this has happened with like Manuman, right? With our wild rice. They genetically modified it, and then now it affects the real wild rice beds. And they also stole that. They, University of Minnesota, hello, made that patent. And then there's the example that some people are using with psychedelics, talking about tobacco or the poppy plant that used to be medicine. That was actually used by indigenous peoples, and they knew how to use it. And tobacco being used in, to use that colonial term, that sacred way, right? But then, once they're commodified, they change. And marijuana, absolutely. I can't cite it for you, but I was at a conference and I heard somebody talking about a study that said of all the different psychoactive compounds out there, the one that produced the most psychotic breaks was cannabis. Not these other powerful medicines, but yeah, something's happening with the cannabinoids and all of that. That's not natural, right? That are we have cannabinoid receptors, but we weren't maybe meant to receive that much. So something's happening there, and who knows what's going to happen when they start messing with these other spiritual molecules and combining them or genetically modifying them. Absolutely. And I also think about these Western constructs of laws. It was really difficult for the working group to navigate the Colorado open meeting law, which was put in place, I think, to protect the public from public servants not doing business outside of the public eye, right? So it says you have to, if you're one of these appointed bodies, you have to meet in public so the public can listen in, public has to be noticed, and all of this stuff. Everything happens above board in the public eye. Well, this meant that the working group members couldn't form relationships outside of the meetings. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't send emails. And, that's just an example of that clashing of like indigenous ways of relating to each other and to our environment and forming relationships with people to do the work that we're being asked to do, and how Western systems that were maybe put in place for protection don't necessarily support that. Also, when you think about Iboga is now being really lifted up in several areas, and it's the next medicine that Colorado is looking at. There's some movement. The governor of Texas, Rick Perry, has gotten on board with this Ibogaine, Americans for Ibogaine. There's actually a lot of people on the right who are very excited about Iboga. So it's crossed political lines and is, has bipartisan support.
What's the excitement?
It's being touted as treatment for veterans with PTSD. It also is clinically proven to be an opioid addiction breaker. Like it'll break any addiction. It'll completely reset the person. No withdrawals. They just come out of the experience, free of addiction, and whether they're having the experience in a ceremonial setting with the natural medicine or in a clinical setting with the synthetic ibogaine. And so I find it really interesting, and I comment whenever I can publicly, and I appreciate y'all listening to me. If you've heard me say it before, I find it very disturbing that we are looking to heal veterans from their their PTSD, not historical trauma. That's me. I have PTSD too. We're looking to heal these veterans from their PTSD, but we're not actually stopping the wars that caused that PTSD. Right. So they'd like to develop a pharmaceutical to address opioid addiction from the pharmaceutical that they created from the poppy plant to create that addiction. Right. So
why they went to war in the first place.
Yeah. Like, just like, come on, people.
In Afghanistan, like, they don't talk about it, but yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think, this is just reminding me that, like, a lot of this comes down to what we would call in, like, the social sciences techno fixes, or like even in like climate change sort of jargon. It's like, so we have this problem of global warming, right? And it's undeniable, right? There's climate chaos, there's all these things, and there's this idea that you can create like a techno fix, right? You can do individual things, like you can take shorter showers, you can spray metallic gas into the atmosphere to reflect the solar. These are things that people have actually proposed. Or you can create, giant air filters that will, filter out all the carbon in the atmosphere. These are all like considered like techno fixes. Well, we just need a technology to undo the technology or the social condition that created this problem in the first place. This is very similar, kind of a similar approach. It's like, we have a lot of people who are suffering PTSD. We have a lot of people who are suffering social alienation and anxiety. It's not the dopamine casinos in our pocket that are doing this. That maybe we should actually regulate that, and the social media giants that have really captured the attention and the mental health of a lot of people. But instead, we're going to create a drug that's going to snap. One day you take a pill and we
want the quick fix. Yep.
It's all done, and we don't care, the social cost that it costs on other people, right? And so with every technology, there's always a consequence, right? It doesn't mean that technology is bad. I'm not an anti-tech, anti-Western, or anti-civ thing, or whatever they call that, but it because we, like, as you said, and I really like this term you call indigenous biotechnology. And there was actually a question, and I want to go back to it because I think it was from Jen Marley, former co-host of the Red Nation podcast. Hello, Jen. She has several comments here. I'll just read all three of them and maybe you can respond. So Jen Marley says, do we have to talk about Catholic, excuse me, I can't really read this.
Sacraments is biotechnology?
That's
interesting.
Yeah, the inequality in how we have to talk about what is sacred, in quotations, shows that this is a sovereignty issue.
Oh yeah.
We are the only ones subjected to extraction of sacred medicines in this particular way. It can't happen the other way around. We're reaching an impasse with legal forms of struggle. We exhausted civil rights law, and we are now forced to defend ourselves via property law.
Yeah.
This shifts how we relate to ourselves as nations.
Well, so the peyote people in the United States, the tribal members, are still using, the American Indian rights era, civil rights era laws. We're definitely relying on AIRFA to protect our right to use peyote as a sacrament, as it's described in the law. The international legal frameworks that we're talking about under kind of like cultural intellectual property laws, and also the new WIPO treaty, the UN WIPO treaty that got signed and ratified last May, was about genetic heritage, cultural and genetic heritage, protecting that kind of under the same, intellectual property framework. So we're using everything we can, because absolutely we're constantly under attack, and nothing's going to change and nobody's going to heal until we address the issues at the heart of these things. This is about, a lot of people in the psychedelic movement are, maybe second generation hippies, or new age people, whatever. They're in awe of indigenous wisdom and spirituality, and they want that. They're disconnected from their own cultural ancestral roots. A lot of people think this is, going to expand people's consciousness, that it's an opportunity for humans to evolve. And sometimes I chuckle to myself because I'm like, yeah, maybe there is that potential. However, humanity is not going to evolve with these techno fixes. And that's not just the name of a new DJ. That is like, we need to address the issues here, which is that humanity has created a global society where it is disconnected from itself. And that is because we are nature, and we are being more and more disconnected from nature. If you're fascinated and drawn to indigenous spirituality, these are earth-based religions that have this cosmological understanding that we are part of nature. And so if you just sit with that for a bit, you don't even need mushrooms.
Yeah. And it's also this idea, it's kind of like this, I don't know, like if you watch YouTube, I used to watch a lot of YouTube. I don't watch as much anymore, but there's this kind of self-help culture where you can kind of get like into a hobby or something like that. And, if you start waking up at 5 a.m. every day and doing your morning routine, your life is going to be better. And it's like, just forget about the rest of the whole world. Because it's like with this, what you're talking about with this earth-based religion, I might call it something different, but if you look at the water protector movement, that actually means like confronting capitalism and extraction. And there are severe consequences to doing that, to actually sustaining our lifeways. I mean, we've seen several generations now of indigenous-led climate justice movements to protect land and territory. Now even protecting things like these medicines. There's consequences to doing this kind of work. And so maybe we can shift the focus a little bit more into the research that you did and with certain individuals, and what their sort of responses were to a lot of these sort of changes. And I don't really know, I haven't read the research, so maybe you can guide me through it about like what was your sort of what was your questions that you asked, and like what were some sort of common responses from people, especially addressing many of the topics that we just kind of went through.
Yeah, sorry you didn't get to read it, but it'll be published soon. So yeah, I had 5 research questions, and I kind of covered those already. Healing. What are Native people doing for healing? What are they healing from? What is their involvement or association with the Native American church? Because not all participants were in the Native American church, so that I could have some comparison there. And then what are their concerns about AIRFA, American Indian Religious Freedom Act? Again, whether they're in the Native American church or not. And, or, do they think AIRFA is fine? Or do they think it needs to be amended again? What are their thoughts? And then if they are familiar with peyote ways, are they concerned about conservation of peyote? Because it's not technically on the endangered list in the United States, but it's vulnerable. And its population has been declining for decades. And it's a very slow growing cactus, and there's lots of issues around conservation. So I wanted to explore that a little bit. And then the last question was about the psychedelic movement. What did people know about the psychedelic? Were they familiar with it? And did they, were they excited about it? Were they willing to engage with it? Or were they concerned and wanting it to, stop? And of course, the answers were all over the board. It was a study with 13 individual interviews, a 6-person focus group, and an anonymous online survey with 50 respondents. So all in all, 69 participants, if I got my numbers right. I'm going from memory here. And yeah, so it's a lot, right? But I don't know where you kind of want me to dive in.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about how like people like responded to the way that indigenous medicines were being taken up, like both from the recreational point of view, but then also for this therapeutic, for this therapeutic applications.
Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, thank you. So, the psychedelic movement. What were people thinking about that? I mean, and I saw some generational differences. Obviously, people that are like our parents' age, from the boomer generation, immediately referred back to the 60s, and a couple of elders that I interviewed were definitely like, it's a drug. Psychedelics are drugs, and I don't, I've been sober and I don't do drugs. Right? So there was that perspective that was very real for them. And there were other perspectives about like younger generations, some millennials that were more open to psychedelic therapy as a treatment for historical trauma. They were willing to engage either with like mushroom therapy or mushroom ceremony. So what I did was I had a question for interviewees and survey respondents that was kind of comparing like, would you be more likely to do these medicines, these natural medicines, like the 4 that Colorado legalized, in therapy or ceremonial setting? And surprisingly, and these are all Native people that participated. Surprisingly, they were more comfortable with therapeutic setting, clinical models, and at the same time as some talked about distrust of the medical system in the first research question area about healing and health, where they weren't as willing to engage with the medical model for either cognitive behavioral therapy or prescriptions for mental health, like treating anxiety and depression. So yeah, it was a little bit all over the board when it came to these perspectives. So isn't that just how research goes? So I mean, I tried to make some sense of it in the conclusions, but it's a lot. It was a big study covering a lot of topics. And my advisor kept talking about, you're just putting one brick in this wall of knowledge. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things to do with PhD research is keep it very narrow, especially indigenous methodologies where we realize how things are connected. And I couldn't just focus on one area without looking at the whole.
Yeah, that's an interesting finding, because you would think that maybe there would be more, openness and engaging it in a ceremonial setting. But I wonder also if the people that you interviewed had engaged those things in a ceremonial setting, like what sort of percentage or what sort of portion of them did.
I didn't ask them if they had, just if they would be willing. So that's, I already had, my survey was like over 100 questions.
Yeah. So not trying to like play like Monday,
I know, I should have, coulda, woulda, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting too is I think so not everybody, right, falls into this, but some of the people who answered that way were not as comfortable doing a ceremony that belonged to another indigenous tribe or tradition, right? Like, I think there were plenty of Native research participants who were like, that's their ceremony, that's their way. If I'm going to do I would rather, some people wanted to do it in ceremony with indigenous peoples and were like, yeah, absolutely, that's the only way I would do it. And others were like, no, I would just have it be, westernized. And especially Boga, which has a lot of contraindications for cardiovascular health. It's really hard on your heart during the ceremony and the experience. And if you have any heart issues, you're not supposed to do that ceremony.
I guess like maybe a bigger question is, what was the sort of big takeaway for you after reading all of this and like compiling, like what was the thing that maybe stood out to you, that maybe one thing that you that was unexpected? I think that was one of them that was unexpected, but then also what was the sort of overarching sort of, I guess, like finding in general that kind of like confirmed maybe some your like initial theses, or maybe like challenged them, or maybe like expanded them?
Yeah. Two big findings that it boils down to is that it is triggering historical trauma in the participants, in Native Americans. This threat to peyote medicine, which is, very healing, very embedded in our ancestral practices. after everything has been taken, over centuries and so much loss and historical grief, to have this last remaining thing also be under threat while colonization actually still continues in all its forms against our peoples. It's devastating. So, this study absolutely supports that this is triggering historical trauma, and that the um, psychedelic movement at large, the legalization and commodification of various sacred medicines from indigenous traditions is perpetuating colonization, that it's ongoing colonization. So coined the term psychedelic colonialism.
Very fascinating. And let's get into the sort of conservation aspect of this, because I mean, you're wearing a t-shirt that's about conservation. And maybe I think you and I were talking about this the last time, but this is about a peyote garden in Texas.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk about the sort of the issues that came up with this particular peyote garden, how it's managed, who kind of funds and supports the conservation efforts, and then who comes in and manages these gardens, and what sort of issues does that bring about?
Yeah.
Because you have kind of overlapping interests. You have the people who are the landowners, you have the people who are the harvesters and the caretakers, but then also you have this kind of broader colonial structure on top of that.
Yeah. Well, it was my friend and my sister Dawn Davis who did her. When I met her, she was doing her PhD research, and she was focusing on peyote conservation. So I wouldn't say I'm the expert in that, but there was that section in my research that asked participants what they knew or thought about it. And what it really comes down to, and then I'll talk a little bit about, my t-shirt with the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. In the research, I asked questions like, have you ever harvested your own medicine? Or, how often do you buy it from the peyoteros, which is the peyoteros are the DEA approved sellers. They're DEA approved drug dealers, essentially. And so the peyoteros don't necessarily come from a peyote tradition, from my understanding. There's only a couple of licensed peyote sellers in the United States, and they're not Native American. So I actually heard stories from research participants about negative experiences with peyoteros, the desire for their medicine to be harvested in a cultural way with an offering made and blessings and prayers said. And a lot of people had not actually been to what we call the peyote gardens, which is the area of Southwest Texas where peyote grows naturally. It only grows in one area on the entire planet, and that area, that natural habitat, crosses between Texas and the Mexico side of the border. And it takes money to go down there. And so this IPCI, this Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, has this thing where they call it a spiritual pilgrimage, and they invite people down to that land where the peyote grows and allow them to do what they're calling a spiritual and ecological harvest. So they're teaching them how to harvest the peyote with ecological conservation in mind. There's a way to cut the peyote so that it will regenerate. You don't want to take it if it's too small, because then it hasn't flowered and fruited and reproduced itself, things like that. So they do it ecologically, but they also consider the spiritual aspect of the harvest. And, while I didn't write about that extensively in my research because I didn't want to focus on one organization, I did ask some of those questions, and I do think that the work they're doing at IPCI is important because of that opportunity for people to reconnect with their medicine in that way. However, there's some controversy that I wrote about. I documented some things. There was a pharmaceutical company in 2022 that was trying to patent mescaline, which just created a lot of it triggered a lot of trauma. It created a lot of issues. And so I talk about that a little bit in the lit review and how it shows up in the participant responses. But yeah, I do believe that Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative is doing good work. This, again, I want to say this is separate from the research. This, what I'm saying now has just been gathered from my work in Colorado and the work that I've been doing since. And you asked about the funding, and I think they are funded through the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. And I don't know where the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund gets all of its money, but it's an international nonprofit that funds not only the peyote initiative, but they fund people in the Amazon who are trying to not just protect their medicine, but get water to their villages, protect against deforestation, things like that. They support Blessings of the Forest, which is the NGO in Gabon, Africa, that helps with the conservation of iboga. And I believe they support some mushroom tribes in Mexico as well. So there's been some talk about, where do they get their money from? Is it coming from people with psychedelic interests? It's a nonprofit, so all that information is public knowledge, and you can look it up, do a deep dive if that's where you want to go with it. I think what I've witnessed is that there are some people. Oh, we'll pick on David Bronner because I actually know him and I would consider him a friend. When I first met him, I was just like, oh wow, this is the guy that he owns that Dr. Bronner soap, right? So like immediately it's hippie culture, right? Like I've never been to Burning Man, but I imagine there's a lot of Dr. Bronner soap at Burning Man. So, and he's been written about a lot in the media. So just Google him, David Bronner. And hey, David, if you're watching, he has supported some of the psychedelic legislation. I think he gave money to a political action committee to get the psychedelic law passed in Colorado. I believe his PAC supported Massachusetts, which was a failed effort. And I think because of that, some people would criticize if he donated part of his wealth to, say, the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund or the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. And I would respond with why, just because he has one interest doesn't mean he can't support the conservation and the Indigenous perspectives that are, maybe he recognizes that this is impacting Indigenous peoples and he wants to help. Is he washing his hands? Is he, trying to clear his guilty conscience? You can argue all of those different opinions. I think, it's probably between him and God.
Yeah. And I think this is also just in the absence of sort of regulation and protection. This is the kind of things that you get. I mean, like you have, there's this, like if you go back to Standing Rock, there was the whole argument that the state, like this in the context of this, it was the state of North Dakota and later on Energy Transfer Partner. They argued that these nonprofits were the ones who were basically like leading this movement. And it was like actually that even if they were, it doesn't really matter because you weren't even following your own laws. So it's this whole argument about like it's sidestepping the larger question. It's like you can say, there's special interests at play in these nonprofits, but at the end of the day, it's still a colonial system.
Oh yeah.
And there's still going to be this exploitation. I think it's not a good place to be. I think many of us would prefer not to have either of those options. But that's what we have. And I think what you're kind of saying here, and I think there's been some efforts, like I think what I talked about with Vivi Camacho, especially in Bolivia, there are efforts to curtail, manage, and regulate specifically ayahuasca, because like look at Bolivia, its national plant is coca, the coca leaf. And if we go into look at like what the Trump administration is doing in the Caribbean, it's bombing boats that are allegedly carrying like cocaine into the United States. I mean, I say allegedly, like with a strong emphasis on allegedly. We don't actually know. We haven't been provided any sort of evidence, but nonetheless, this has become the justification for not just this escalation in the Caribbean, but a broader sort of war on drugs in places like Bolivia, the Andean regions, Colombia, without really ever sort of understanding that the United States is the main, I would say, like, quote unquote, beneficiary of that
Mhm.
drug war on
Yeah.
both ends, the fighting of it, but also the perpetuation of it.
Mm.
There, some people have called it drug war capitalism. I think in this context, it's a little bit different, but also kind of the same, because coca is a sacred plant. It's a medicine. It's widely used, but it's also a way to criminalize anything that the United States sees as a threat. In this case, they saw the indigenous, movements that, the coca growers in Bolivia, they just call them narco terrorists, the same
Mhm.
way that they're calling, the people in the Caribbean and people from Venezuela, entire governments, entire countries, narco terrorists.
Mm.
So we have to be really careful about, the accusations that we're throwing around, and remember that this is a way that is used to actually criminalize indigenous people. And so I guess, like, one, getting on this question again, but it's like, in your research, there seems to be, in some ways, sort of an irreconcilable sort of antagonism between how both therapy and recreational, users um, want to I guess, consume these medicines. But then also with indigenous communities, you pointed out some ways that indigenous communities have participated in sort of processes of, like, ethical consumption or use, or relationships of reciprocity. Like, I know that I don't want to get, like, too, like, grand, because it's, like, obviously not, one size fits all. But can you point to other examples where indigenous peoples are participating in research in ethical ways, maybe with other indigenous researchers who are interested in this topic? I mean, maybe you could count yourself among that that
Mm.
crowd.
Yeah, there aren't enough indigenous researchers. And I was actually just having this conversation with somebody last night, saying, when you read my dissertation, if you disagree with the findings, please, like, do some research. Like, we need more. Like, I don't want to be the only person having this conversation. Dawn Davis embargoed her dissertation, so I haven't been able to read it. I know another Indigenous woman who's going to be doing some research. She's a PhD candidate at Berkeley. Hello, Marlena. So, there's like a handful of us. And we really need more Indigenous research in this field. So I just recently met some folks through, like, a research consortium internationally that are doing some work in New Zealand. So there's the opportunity to collaborate there. There's a real need for maybe some of the PhDs out there to be primary investigators to support Indigenous people's involvement in research, from developing and design studies from the
Mm.
beginning. That's very important. Don't design a study and then go ask Indigenous people to participate. We need to be co-creators of the knowledge, and that means conceptualizing it from the beginning. There seems to be a really strong desire when I talk to people, especially in the scientific community, of doing that kind of co-creation of knowledge and research partnership. It's just a matter of bandwidth and limited capacity. But to go back to what you were talking about earlier, that's really fascinating. And I try to balance this very, like, academic way that I've learned to engage my mind with staying grounded in my cultural and spiritual teachings and ways. And so sometimes when I talk, I try not to talk like an academic. So thanks for filling in the gaps with all the technical terms. But when you were talking, I just thought, like, violence has no place with these medicines. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I keep going back to that term sacred, but, like, spiritual. Like, this is where we heal ourselves, where our hearts can open, where we heal the bonds with our family, with nature, with ourselves, with our ancestors. Like, we're healing from violence. So to, like, these are not drugs. These are not, they should not be classified in that category. We could get into we do a whole nother podcast on the war on drugs. There are some people that come at psychedelics with the idea of cognitive liberty, where, you should just have the right to try anything. And I do what I want with my body and my brain. If that means, heroin or crack cocaine or whatever. Dr. Carl Hart talks about that. And so, there's a lot of perspectives out there, but just thinking about the indigenous peoples that I have learned from, that violence really has no place in the conversations, the ceremonies, and the relationships with these medicines, and all the controversy that is happening over who's giving you money and who owns what, who's trying to patent what. Really, that is detrimental to the healing movement. And I did hear some stories about in ayahuasca tribes in the Amazon that the lure to go of their young people to leave their village and go to the city and, sell ayahuasca ceremony is really starting to impact their families and in their communities. And so, even if you have that kind of experience where you think the indigenous person has consented and is voluntarily sharing it with you, there might be other factors at play,
Mhm.
right? There may be better opportunities for them in the city that they feel like, they want to take advantage of economically. And that's why they're selling their sacred ceremonies, right? Does it make it right? I don't know. I'm really in the position where I ask a lot more questions than I have answers to, even though I asked 100 questions from 69 people and maybe have some answers, but really it came up with more questions. So I just want everybody to take what I'm saying here, even though I'm supposed to be the expert and the researcher here, with a grain of salt. Like, these are really questions that deserve more consideration, more dialogue, respectful dialogue. People can disagree. Yeah, we just need to be coming together, not fighting over resources.
Yeah, and I think you raised a lot of good points, and I think this is, like, for me, it's been eye opening about just like learning about this, because it's so it's new in some ways, but it's also not. And I think some of the comments we're getting in the chat are like related to questions of ethics and methodology and research methodology. And I just want to say, you got your PhD in Indigenous studies,
Yes,
right?
yes.
There's a very few like doctoral programs in Indigenous studies, and I teach, an American Indian and Indigenous studies doctoral program. And
Mhm.
one of the things we emphasize is research, like research ethics, over and over and over again. And like, even if the institution you work for, the institutions you're working with, claim to have like Indigenous protocols and all these things, they can still violate them. Like,
Mhm.
and people do I call it pick an Indian, where it's like they just go out and they pick an Indian, and they're like, this is the expert, they're going to say all these things.
Yeah.
And then there's the other part of it is like, just because somebody doesn't tell you no doesn't mean that that's consent,
Mhm.
or that you should go ahead with your research. I think, like, if you're not having, like a full, like, in-depth sort of conversation, an honest conversation with somebody, and when you're doing research with a community, not in a community or on a community, but with a community on these topics, and you ever kind of come up with, this question of like, if should I even be doing this? Then you're probably not doing, I don't know, you're not asking the right questions. If
Yeah.
you've never second guessed yourself, and as Indigenous people who get to these like levels of, research, it's something that we take very seriously. And we don't come to these sort of like these conversations as like knowing everything, because everything is very contingent upon, I guess, how we ask questions. And
Yeah.
that's the important thing. And I think you're raising a lot of questions, because I don't, in my community, and the people that I know, like, relationally, there actually are very different perspectives on this. And I think some people would
Mhm.
agree with you. I think some people would really disagree with you. I disagree with some people's takes on it. Like, I think some people were like, yes, open it up. Like, we should patent, or it doesn't matter if they patent the, the synthetic version of peyote, because that's not the real, plant medicine. Where some people are like, but why is this necessary? Kind of
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So I think your research is coming at a really important time, and it's good to hear that there's other people out there doing this, because I think it is, especially when it intersects with the biotech realm, pharmaceuticals, therapeutic sort of applications, you run into all of these problems. And I think some of the other questions before that some people had brought up is, it is a question of sovereignty, but it's not just as easy as going to one tribe or one group of like one community or one individual and getting one answer, because there's such a diversity of use and application, right? And I think there's this kind of, like, I guess I would call it just a sort of puritanical nature of of colonialism, and this idea that, like, knowledge is only one way,
Right.
that happens even in these conversations. And I think a lot of people are coming a lot of people are coming at different different perspectives, and I love debate. I'm not afraid. Conflict does
Yeah.
not harm.
Right, right. It's okay to disagree.
Yeah.
We can debate. It doesn't mean we have to hate each other or
Yeah.
tear each other down. It means maybe we'll learn from each other. Maybe we'll find a common ground or a simple solution that addresses everybody's perspectives. Yeah, this was community-based that research. Didn't want to say that word, I guess. They participated, okay? And it wasn't in one community. So that's the interesting thing is, I tried to make it national. And so in that way, it allowed me to move it forward and not spend 10 years on trying to go to one community, because if I would have just done like one tribal community, there would have been a lot more protocols to follow, right? Like I said earlier, you go to the community or the indigenous group or whatever, and you say, this is what I'm in, what would you like to research, right? You don't prescribe. So that's a process, developing the relationship, developing the trust, and then designing the research study. Well, I knew that I wanted to take like kind of a national snapshot, so it wasn't going to involve just one community, which also allowed me to go to urban communities and not have to get tribal IRB approval. So I had IRB approval through my university, but like, let's say if I went to Turtle
Right.
Mountain, where I'm from, we have our own IRB as well. And so, I would have had to get like 20 IRB approvals, and good God, would that even be possible?
Yeah.
Like, you know how hard it is to get one, right? So these are some things that made my research unique, in that I could actually move through it a little bit more quickly, and not get too grounded in one particular community or one particular tribal government, right? So I did not involve tribal governments. Everybody had to be a tribal citizen, but the research didn't take place on tribal lands. So I literally got in my camper trailer and drove around the country interviewing people. And so that's how the community research was designed. And, I think it's interesting because there were a lot of different perspectives on what we were talking about earlier, in terms of, the disagreements, the kind of like, is the land where the Peyote Conservation Initiative happening, like, is that a good thing? Some participants talked about it and said they had been, and that they really appreciated the opportunity to go and harvest their own medicine. Other people had never harvested and didn't know what I was talking about. And so there is an opportunity to provide further education. And in terms of that intention with, like you said, how you ask the questions and why did I do this research? That's why I tell the story. Like, my positionality is really important in this Indigenous research. Who am I? I'm a Native woman who has been colonized and traumatized by Indigenous Indian boarding schools, by colonization, by the loss of language and culture. And in my own personal healing journey, I found this medicine. I had not done peyote until I started to think about doing this research, and I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what this was all about and what were the issues, because For some reason, with my boarding school healing work and all the trauma that I've lived through and walked through in my life, my journey has led me to be an advocate. I'm an advocate and a researcher. I did research at the Boarding School Healing Coalition too. We had to find the records in order to prove to the government that there was harm that was done so that they could do the truth action like Canada did. So we introduced legislation. Like, that's what I do. And so what am I doing in the psychedelic space is a continuation of that same work. I'm doing research to further my healing, other people's healings, to advocate for the right to these medicines. And when you talk about sovereignty, that's kind of a loaded term, right? This says planting seeds of sovereignty. And I was like, I guarantee somebody's going to watch this and be mad that I wore this shirt. Hi. So, there's tribal sovereignty. And then in my dissertation, I wrote about cultural sovereignty, spiritual sovereignty, right? What about the indigenous peoples who don't have federal recognition? The Lipan Apache, whose homelands are actually in the Peyote Gardens, who aren't federally recognized. What about somebody from the Mexico side of the border who grew up in Peyote tradition, who moved to the United States? Where's their tribal sovereignty, right? So you can think about sovereignty in different terms.
Yeah, no, I think that's important too, because I have friends who are on the Mexican side, and they do talk about it. And the way that the Mexican government regulates it or doesn't regulate it at all or protect it at all is has led to a lot of overpicking, exploitation and stuff. And so I think there's just and then also on top of that, it's like they are somehow different when they cross the border, even though they are recognized as indigenous from that side. So yeah, that's a really good point. And I think for me, like, also, I don't talk a lot about my personal life in here, but it has like one of the that boarding school thing was like, it opened a whole Pandora's box for me that I kind of wish sometimes, going back, like, a little part of me wishes I didn't go down that path, because it made me start questioning a lot of things about my own history in ways that I never thought, and actually didn't understand the scale of the boarding school project. This is before the federal report that came out, and I was just shocked because it was it was everywhere. It was like almost in every single state, that this had happened. And every person that I talked to, it happened to. And when I started talking about it with my family and my friends and people that I knew, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse as it went down. And the further you got to it, and now it's sort of recognized as something that happened, but like literally 10 years ago, it was not something that people really talked about. In Canada, there was a much more, political and cultural conversations around, the reserve system, and just an acknowledgement of what happened to what's happening to Indigenous people. But here, it's very sort of it's erased. It's under constant erasure, and so one of the things that was like difficult in that, because these things affect you, it's like, even talking about this, it brings up so many emotions for different kinds of people, not just this topic, but many topics. Like we were talking about earlier today, before you and I started having a conversation about questions about what to do with Fort Snelling. There, it's a genocide site here. It's a concentration camp. It's where they lynched Native people. There's a group, there's an interest group in the state that has very close ties to this university and many state institutions that want to keep this open as a tourist attraction, but also want to redwash it in terms of bringing like Indigenous themes and Indigenous buy-in to a project. And it's so controversial. Like it to me, it's like I don't have any other feeling but like absolute rage, when somebody brings that up. And so I'm talking about this because it's like it related. I mean, you call it historical trauma, and it's it is historic, but it's also like ongoing because it hasn't ended. And I think even in the context of when we're talking about techno fixes and we're talking about quick fixes for PTSD, anyone who knows anything about like what's happening in the world, whether it's the genocide in Gaza and Palestine, these things take generations to work themselves out. Like the boarding school, well, I'm one generation removed, but some people are several generations removed, but are still impacted by it. And I think when we think about the way, like, this turn that a lot of people take towards indigenous medicines, and again, not all of them are psychedelic. Like, this is just one. I think you're just talking about a sliver, but it's getting a lot of attention for the reasons that we just talked about, because of the recreational use, the therapeutic use, potentially the pharmaceutical use. And when we're in these, in this moment, it's like there are, it's a very, I don't know, it's something that it's like, I've just accepted that this is going to be something I'm going to deal with for the rest of my life. But when people are turning towards these sorts of forms of healing and medicine and reclamation, it should not be triggering. It should not be traumatic. It should not be like, as we see in some of the comments, I'm sure you've encountered in your research, it is for people, because we still live in a colonial world, and I think, and so, like, even our forms of healing are colonized. That's basically my takeaway from our conversation.
Yes, culture is constantly evolving, right?
Yeah.
So we adapt as people, as indigenous peoples, we adapt to survive. And in order to heal a wound, you must clean it first. You must examine it. You must clean it out, get the air in there, let the sunlight hit it, make sure there aren't any little remnants left behind. It has to be cleaned out. It can't just be covered up. And that's a painful process. I remember trying to say something when we were at the Boarding School Healing Coalition about, healing is hard, healing is messy, healing hurts, right? And my communication director was like, no, you can't say that. Like, no, it has to be inspirational. And I was like, I'm just here telling the truth. This damn healing is hard. So yeah, I definitely feel that it's difficult to face these things sometimes. And I did see that one comment that really made me smile about research as ceremony. And I write about it in the dissertation about how I came to this place, right? I followed a path. I was given an eagle feather when I got my master's degree from creator themselves. No, I didn't get one from my family. I felt so pitiful for myself, and I prayed and I asked for an eagle feather to fall from the sky, because I saw eagles down by the river where I lived by all the time. And I actually found one about 2 months later. I found an eagle feather. I was so excited. I took a picture, I sent it to my friend, and she said, "Oh, Christine, that's beautiful." And she said, "That's an adolescent eagle feather," because it was spotted. I didn't know. And I was like, "Oh, what does that mean?" She said, "That means you're not done with your education." And I had just finished the master's. I was like, no, I'm not going to get a PhD. But here we are, lo and behold. There was a through line about all these things on, the impacts of Christianity and colonization and boarding schools on our healing ways, our sacred ceremonies, and the healing potential of these sacred medicines, and also the need for advocacy. I heal through using my voice. I heal through engaging in those difficult conversations with myself, with my family members, with my community members. That's the thing. Indigenous peoples are, you're part of a community. So everything I say here, I might hear from different community members what they think about what I'm saying. Sometimes I'm sharing research. Sometimes I'm just sharing opinions. Okay, folks. Sometimes I'm sharing personal perspectives and experiences, which are, mine alone. But yeah, there's a lot to be said about how this psychedelic movement is impacting people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I think we're all here to learn something together. And I do believe in the potential for the evolution of humanity. I believe that that is what this movement is all about. I'm just constantly going to be telling all the white folks who will listen that you can't have healing for some at the expense of others. You cannot have a healing movement for all that harms the Indigenous peoples who stewarded these medicines and these sacred knowledge systems to get to this point, to benefit the rest of humanity. I think there's a lot to learn, not in just this mental health area, but in all these areas that you're talking about, Nick, environmental stewardship, economic considerations, like Indigenous peoples. We gave democracy to the world. We have so much to offer.
Yeah, it's very yeah. There's, and then going back to even like the corn. I think what's interesting too, and this kind of goes back into the kind of recess of like, there's all these like right wingers out there, like I think Candace Owens and others, they always like pile on Indigenous people of like, what did we actually give to humanity or whatever, like as they say it when they're standing on our land, like first of all, it's like, oh, did you bring that from Europe? Like I don't like, I don't know. Or the other one is like corn, all like I think it was like 40% of like the global diet is
corn?
Yeah, not just corn, but like plants that came from the Americas, so and that were cultivated by Indigenous people and harvested. And so there are these technologies that you consume every single day that are Indigenous innovations.
Right, but they're taking it. When you said, I was like, it's corn syrups and everything, right? That's like, and then I had a moment thinking about that movie Interstellar, where all they had left was corn.
Oh yeah, like at the end, like when all the plants had died. But well, we're at like an hour and a half, and I really appreciate you taking the time, Christine. I don't know if there's anything else that like kind of that you want to add to this conversation.
I do. Thank you. Yes. So kind of in closing, I appreciate the dialogue and the care that you're giving to allowing me to talk about the research and how it was done, and maybe some of the controversy that will come up around it. And it wasn't my intention to do this research to create controversy or to, have some notoriety for myself. As I said, I wrote my intentions clearly. I prayed. I did treat the research as ceremony and ask Creator to guide me on this path. And I did go down to the peyote gardens and prayed right before I started doing the field research. And I recently just went back down there again at Thanksgiving to pray and offer my thanks and gratitude, which was the most amazing feeling and experience that I really do think this was spirit guided. So I had to write an epilogue to the dissertation to talk about the environment that this research will land in. That there is some conflict that's happening amongst peyote people that is the opposite of the healing that this medicine represents and is here for. So I encourage you all to read that research. In the epilogue, I say that I received some intense criticism before I even published from people who had not even yet read it. And that says a lot right there. This was not meant to cause any harm. And I really am not, taking a swing at anybody in my research. I'm just chronicling and documenting the landscape that we're living in right now, and talking about what the research participants said. That's it. There was no like agenda to take someone down or lift someone up. It's just research. It's supposed to be objective that way. Other than my bias as a Native person seeking her own healing through this medicine. And yeah, in the epilogue, I say, hey, go ahead and argue with me. I invite your criticisms and your critiques in a respectful way. If you disagree, please, reach out. If there's something that you think I need to correct, that you have, data that conflicts, please share it. We can write an article. We can what do they call that? Write an errata?
Errata, or I don't even know.
Something, like an addendum or whatever.
I'm an academic and I don't even know.
I know. My advisor shared that term. I was like, never heard of that. See, I'm still learning new words, y'all, and I'm a doctor. So we're here to continue learning and growing with each other, walking hand in hand, trudging the road to happy destiny. Okay. So, read the research and let it open your mind, let it expand your heart. If you disagree, let's talk, let's be professional, let's stay respectful. There shouldn't be threats of violence around discussion of sacred medicine. And I think that's a good place to end it.
Yeah. And so if people want to follow your work, where can they find you?
Oh, well, I have a website, www.christinemccleave.com, and I'm on Instagram, Christine.McCleave1. And that's about a good place to start. Yeah.
Cool. And so for those of you who are listening or watching, those are all in the show notes. It was also in the show promotion. So if you go on our social medias, you can find that as well. So thank you so much, Christine. This was wonderful. It's good to reconnect as well. It's like kind of full circle. Did I have my PhD? I just got my PhD when I met you in Carlisle. So then I
what
saw
do you know?
Yeah,
then
I saw you
inspired
here.
Me.
Like, yeah. So it's good to have a fellow, Native person out there doing this kind of research, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. I actually might have you on again because I'm sure we got a lot of feedback just in the chats. So we really appreciate everyone who tuned in, asked questions, commented. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I actually can't wait to read your dissertation too. So I'll check that out as well. And hopefully we'll hopefully this will come out and we'll just throw it in the show notes too. So
awesome. Yes, I'm going to put it on the website. I'll let you know as soon as it's published and online. And I would love to come back and talk about it after people have had a chance to read it. Yeah, that'd be great.